The soft glow of the setting sun painted the sky in warm hues, but for young Delilah Grant, the world had never felt darker. She was only 16, walking home from school on what should have been a normal, uneventful day. She clutched her textbooks tightly against her chest, a nervous habit she had developed during stressful times. The streets were quiet, a little too quiet. Delilah's family lived in a small, close-knit neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, or at least that's what they believed. The familiarity brought a false sense of security that shattered in an instant when a man appeared from the shadows. He was wearing a mask, his voice gruff and commanding as he forced her into an alleyway. Her screams were muffled by his hand, and what followed was a blur of pain, terror, and humiliation. When it was over, he disappeared, leaving Delilah broken and trembling on the cold pavement. She staggered home, her heart heavy with shame, and she couldn't bring herself to tell her parents. The police report she eventually filed felt more like a formality than a path to justice. Her assailant was never caught. That day changed Delilah forever. Once a cheerful, outgoing girl with dreams of becoming a journalist, she withdrew from her friends and family. School became unbearable, every unfamiliar glance feeling like a potential threat. At night, she lay awake, haunted by nightmares that replayed the attack in vivid detail. Her parents, though supportive, struggled to understand the depth of her trauma. They tried everything: therapy, distractions, even moving to a new town, but Delilah remained trapped in her own mind. Trust became an impossibility, and love seemed like a distant, unreachable concept. Years passed, and Delilah rebuilt herself piece by piece. In her late 20s, she moved to a bustling city where she could blend into the crowd and escape the whispers of her past. She worked as a marketing consultant, throwing herself into her career to distract from the emptiness she felt inside. Despite her achievements, Delilah lived cautiously, avoiding intimate relationships and keeping people at arm's length. The walls she had built around herself were sturdy, but they also left her lonely. It was during this time that Julius Parker entered her life. Julius was charming, attentive, and persistent, qualities Delilah initially found overwhelming. He was a well-known figure in the community, running a successful nonprofit that helped at-risk youth. They met at a charity gala where he introduced himself with a warm smile and a firm handshake. "You're Delilah, right? I've heard a lot about you from our mutual friends," he said. She nodded politely, not offering much more than a guarded smile in return. Julius didn't push. Instead, he respected her boundaries, asking her to coffee weeks later instead of pressing for an immediate connection. Delilah reluctantly agreed, expecting the meeting to be a one-time thing. To her surprise, Julius was easy to talk to. He shared stories of his childhood, his struggles, and how he had turned his life around. His vulnerability resonated with her, and for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope. Over the months that followed, Julius became a constant presence in her life. He was patient and kind, never pushing her to open up about her past, but always offering a listening ear. Slowly, Delilah began to trust him, allowing herself to imagine a future where she wasn't defined by her trauma. Their relationship blossomed, and Julius proposed after 2 years of dating. His proposal was simple yet heartfelt, taking place during a quiet dinner at her favorite restaurant. Delilah hesitated, her fears bubbling to the surface. "Are you sure you want to spend your life with someone like me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Julius reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Delilah, you're the strongest person I've ever met. Whatever happened in your past doesn't define who you are today. I love you, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving that to you." His words melted her doubts, and she said yes. Their wedding was a modest affair, attended by close friends and family. For the first time in over a decade, Delilah felt genuinely happy. She believed she had finally escaped the shadows of her past and stepped into the light. But the past has a way of catching up no matter how far you run. On their wedding night, as they sat together in the dimly lit living room of their new home, Julius's demeanor shifted. He seemed nervous, almost fearful, as he fidgeted with his wedding. Delilah, he began, his voice unsteady. There's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you a long time ago. Her stomach tightened. She had never seen him like this before. What is it? Julius hesitated, then took a deep breath. I'm the man who hurt you when you were younger. The room fell silent, the weight of his confession hanging in the air like a suffocating. Delilah stared at him, her mind racing to make sense of his words. What are you talking about? She whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't know it was you at first, he said quickly, as if that would make a difference. When we met, I didn't realize who you were. But as time went on, I started to put the pieces together. I was a different person back then. Angry, reckless, and stupid. I'm so sorry, Delilah. I've changed. I swear I've changed. The world around her seemed to collapse. The man she had trusted, the man she had let into her heart, was the same man who had shattered her life all those years ago. Her body trembled, her mind a whirlwind of pain, betrayal, and fury.
Julius reached for her hand, but she pulled away, her eyes burning with tears. Don't touch me, she said, her voice cold and distant. I understand if you hate me, he said, his voice cracking. But I love you, Delilah. I've spent years trying to be a better man. Please, give me a chance to prove that to you. But Delilah wasn't listening. Her mind had already begun to form a plan, one that would ensure Julius could never hurt anyone again. Delilah sat alone in the dark hours after Julius's confession, the wedding dress still clinging to her body like a suffocating shroud. She had once thought this dress symbolized her transformation, a new chapter of healing and love. Now, it felt like a cruel joke. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the table, her mind replaying his words over and over. I'm the man who hurt you. How could this be real? How could the man she trusted, the man she loved, be the same monster who had haunted her for so many years? The universe had played the ultimate trick on her, letting her rebuild her life only to tear it apart again. She felt rage bubbling within her, hot and consuming. But beneath the fury was a deep, gnawing pain. Julius had gone to the guest room to sleep, respecting her demand for space. The house, once filled with warmth and love, now felt cold and hollow. Delilah stared at the clock on the wall. Each tick sounded like an accusation, reminding her of every moment she had spent with him, every word she had believed. She thought of the nights she had cried in his arms, confessing the depths of her trauma, and how he had comforted her with words of love and reassurance. All of it was a lie. As the hours passed, her fury became more focused. She remembered his expression when he confessed, nervous, yes, but not truly afraid. Did he think she would forgive him? Did he believe his years of redemption erased what he had done to her? The audacity of it made her sick. Forgiveness was not something she could give. Justice, however, was another matter. The next morning, Delilah forced herself to face Julius. He was sitting at the kitchen table, his face pale and drawn. He looked like he hadn't slept, but neither had she. When he saw her, his eyes softened with guilt. Delilah, he began, his voice tentative. I know I can't undo what I did. But I want to make this right. I'll do whatever it takes. Her response was icy and measured. You can't make this right, Julius. You stole something from me that I'll never get back. He nodded, swallowing hard. I understand. But I love you. I've changed. I need you to see that. Delilah tilted her head, studying him. You want me to see that you've changed? Fine. Let's spend some time together. Let's talk this through. Maybe then I'll understand. Julius's face lit up with cautious hope. He reached for her hand, but she stepped back. "Don't touch me," she snapped. "This is for me, not for you." He nodded, his hands retreating. "Whatever you need." Over the next 2 days, Delilah played the role of the conflicted wife. She engaged Julius in long conversations, asking him about his past, his regrets, and his supposed transformation. Each answer he gave only fueled her disgust. He spoke about his anger as a teenager, blaming a rough childhood and bad influences. He claimed he had turned to religion and therapy to find peace, dedicating his life to helping others as penance for his sins. "You're trying to make yourself the hero in this story," Delilah said during one of their talks, her tone laced with bitterness. "But you're not the hero. You're the villain." Julius lowered his head, shame coloring his features. "I know. But villains can change." She wanted to scream at him, to tear apart his fragile narrative of redemption, but she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she played her part perfectly, nodding in mock understanding and pretending to consider his words. All the while, her plan solidified in her mind. If the justice system had failed her when she was 16, she would take justice into her own hands now. The evening before the murder, Delilah cooked dinner for Julius, a rare gesture that caught him off guard. They ate in relative silence, the tension palpable but not unbearable. Delilah excused herself early, claiming she needed to rest. Julius stayed behind, cleaning up the dishes and marveling at what he thought was progress. In the solitude of their bedroom, Delilah stared at the small box she had hidden in her drawer. Inside was the pistol her father had given her years ago for self-defense. She had never fired it before, but she knew how. Her father had insisted on teaching her, saying it was a necessary skill for a woman living alone. She removed the gun from its hiding place, feeling its weight in her hands. It was heavier than she expected, cold and unfeeling. Her heart pounded as she stared at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her wasn't the broken girl she had once been, nor was she the hopeful bride from a few days ago. She was someone else entirely, someone with nothing left to lose. The next morning, Delilah woke early. She found Julius in the living room, sipping coffee and reading a book. He looked up and smiled weakly as she entered. "Morning," he said. "Sleep okay?" She nodded, sitting across from him. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about change and redemption." Julius set his mug down, his expression cautious but hopeful. And I think you're right. People can change. But sometimes, the consequences of their actions catch up with them anyway. The officers moved swiftly, their commands clear and rehearsed. "Ma'am, put your hands up and step away from the table." Before he could respond, Delilah reached into the pocket of her robe and pulled out the gun. Julius's eyes widened in shock as she aimed it at him, her hand steady. "Delilah, wait," he said, raising his hands. "You don't have to do this." Her voice was calm, almost detached. "I do. You might have changed, but that doesn't erase what you did to me. You ruined my life, Julius. And now I'm taking it back." He tried to reason with her, pleading for his life, but she didn't listen. The years of pain and betrayal had numbed her to his words. She pulled the trigger once, then twice, the sound of the shots echoing through the room. Julius slumped forward, his body lifeless. Delilah stood over him, the gun still in her hand. She felt no relief, no satisfaction, only an eerie calm. She set the gun down on the table and dialed 911. "I've just killed my husband," she said when the operator answered. "Please send the police." The morning light filtered through the blinds as the police arrived, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows across the living room. Delilah sat on the couch, her posture composed but her hands trembling slightly. The weapon rested on the coffee table, its presence heavy and undeniable. She had made the call herself, her voice calm as she confessed, "I've harmed my husband. Please send help." Delilah complied, her movements slow and deliberate. She was cuffed and escorted to the squad car without resistance, her gaze distant but resolute. Outside, the early morning quiet of the neighborhood had been replaced by murmurs and gasps from onlookers. The news spread quickly: Delilah Grant, the bride everyone admired, was being taken away in handcuffs just days after her wedding. The ride to the station was silent except for the hum of the engine. The officer driving occasionally glanced at Delilah through the rearview mirror, his expression a mix of curiosity and unease. She sat still, her mind clear despite the enormity of what had just transpired. For years, she had lived in fear and uncertainty, but in this moment, she felt a strange sense of control. The chaos was over, or so she thought. The booking process was procedural, almost mechanical. Delilah answered the officer's questions with clipped precision, her tone devoid of emotion. When they placed her in the holding cell, she sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't try to plead her case or justify her actions to anyone. She was prepared for what was to come. Detective Sarah Ellison was assigned to the case. A seasoned investigator known for her sharp instincts and no-nonsense demeanor, Sarah entered the interrogation room with purpose. She had read the preliminary report: a bride had harmed her husband in their home and immediately confessed. The details were murky, but the situation screamed of something deeper. Sarah placed a recorder on the table, her eyes fixed on Delilah. "I'm Detective Ellison," she began. "Do you want to call a lawyer before we proceed?" Delilah shook her head. "No." "Are you sure? Anything you say can and will be used against you in court." "I understand," Delilah replied evenly. Sarah nodded and leaned forward. "Okay. Let's start from the beginning. Why did you do it?" Delilah's eyes met the detective's, unflinching. "Because he hurt me." There was a pause as Sarah processed the statement. "What do you mean? Are we talking about domestic violence?" Delilah shook her head. "No. This was before we were married. Before we even knew each other, or so I thought." Sarah raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Go on." Delilah took a deep breath, her voice steady as she recounted the events of her past. She described the incident that had changed her life as a teenager, the years of isolation and recovery, and how she had eventually met Julius. Her voice faltered slightly when she reached the part about his confession. "On our wedding night, he told me. He admitted that he was the person who had done it all those years ago. He said he had changed, that he wanted my forgiveness." "And how did that make you feel?" Sarah asked, her voice softer now. Delilah's lips tightened. "How do you think it made me feel? He destroyed my life, and then he pretended to love me. I trusted him. I let him in. And then he admitted that everything was a lie." The detective leaned back, her pen pausing over her notebook. This wasn't the typical case of marital discord, it was far more complex. "So you planned this?" "Yes," Delilah said without hesitation. "I thought about it for 2 days. I decided it was the only way to make things right." Word of Delilah's arrest spread quickly, capturing the attention of the media and dividing public opinion. The community was shocked. Delilah had been a respected figure, intelligent, composed, and kind. How could someone like her commit such an act? The details of her accusation against Julius added layers of complexity, fueling heated debates on whether her actions were understandable or indefensible. Delilah's parents visited her in jail the next day. Her mother, Margaret, was visibly shaken, her eyes red from crying. She sat across from Delilah in the visitation room, separated by a glass partition. "Delilah, why?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you come to us? We could have helped you." Delilah's expression remained calm but resolute. "Because no one could have helped me. Not you, not the police, no one. He took everything from me, Mom. I couldn't just let him get away with it." Margaret sobbed, clutching her husband's hand. Delilah's father, Charles, was silent, his jaw tight as he tried to process the enormity of the situation. "You've thrown your life away," Charles said finally, his voice heavy with emotion. "You had everything going for you, a career, a future. Now look at where you are." Delilah met his gaze. "I was already living a life that wasn't mine. He stole it from me. I took it back." The trial began weeks later, drawing national attention. The courtroom was packed with reporters, spectators, and legal experts eager to witness the unfolding drama. Delilah sat at the defense table, her demeanor composed but somber. Her attorney argued that her actions were the result of years of trauma, compounded by the betrayal of discovering Julius's true identity. They called psychologists and trauma experts to testify, painting a picture of a woman pushed beyond her limits. The prosecution, however, focused on the deliberate nature of her actions. They argued that Delilah had ample opportunity to walk away, to seek legal recourse instead of resorting to violence. This was not a crime of passion, the prosecutor declared during closing arguments. It was cold, calculated revenge. Delilah herself took the stand, recounting her story in vivid detail. Her voice was steady but tinged with raw emotion as she described the events that led to her decision. "I didn't want to harm anyone," she said. "But he left me no choice. He destroyed my life, and then he tried to rewrite the story to make himself the hero. I couldn't let that stand." Her testimony left the courtroom silent, the weight of her words palpable. Some jurors looked visibly moved, while others remained stoic, their expressions unreadable. Outside the courtroom, the public remained deeply divided. Some saw Delilah as a victim who had been driven to an extreme act of justice. Others viewed her as a dangerous individual who had taken the law into her own hands. The case sparked national conversations about trauma, accountability, and the limits of forgiveness. As the trial neared its conclusion, Delilah prepared herself for the verdict. She didn't know what the jury would decide, but she was ready to face whatever came next. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of closure. She had spoken her truth, and whatever the consequences, she would bear them with the same strength that had carried her through her darkest days. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back into their seats, their faces tense with the weight of the decision they were about to deliver. Delilah sat motionless, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The weeks of testimony and legal arguments had worn on her, but she remained composed, her eyes fixed on the foreperson of the jury. Whatever the verdict, she was prepared to accept it. The judge addressed the jury. "Have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson stood, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes that avoided Delilah's gaze. "We have, Your Honor. On the charge of second-degree murder, how do you find the defendant?" The room held its collective breath. Delilah's attorney leaned slightly forward, his expression unreadable. The foreperson cleared her throat. "Guilty." A ripple of noise swept through the gallery, gasping, murmurs, and the shuffling of feet. The judge quickly banged his gavel to restore order. Delilah remained calm, her face a mask of neutrality. She had anticipated this outcome. Her attorney placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, but she didn't acknowledge it. The judge dismissed the jury and turned his attention to Delilah. "Ms. Grant, you have been found guilty of second-degree murder. Your actions, while deeply influenced by past trauma, were premeditated and cannot be condoned under the law. However, the court has taken your circumstances into account. You are hereby sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Delilah nodded slightly, her mind registering the words but feeling strangely detached. The sentence wasn't unexpected. She had prepared herself for it the moment she decided to act. As Delilah was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the crowd outside erupted into chaos. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and onlookers debated loudly. Some chanted in support of her, holding signs that read, "Justice for Delilah." Others jeered, calling her a murderer who had taken the law into her own hands. The world outside the courthouse was as divided as the jury had likely been. Her parents watched from a distance, their faces etched with grief. Margaret clutched a tissue, tears streaming down her cheeks. Charles stood stoically beside her, his jaw clenched. They had come to terms with the verdict, but the sight of their daughter being led away was almost too much to bear. Prison life was a stark contrast to anything Delilah had ever known. The gray walls, the rigid schedules, and the constant noise were overwhelming at first. Her fellow inmates ranged from indifferent to curious, some recognizing her from the news and others too wrapped up in their own lives to care. Delilah kept to herself, avoiding unnecessary interactions. She spent her days reading, exercising, and participating in therapy sessions offered to inmates. The therapy was mandatory, but she found it unexpectedly cathartic. For the first time, she spoke openly about her trauma to someone who wasn't trying to judge or justify her actions. It was a space where she could simply be. Months turned into years, and Delilah adapted to her new reality. She became known as a quiet but helpful presence among the inmates, tutoring others in basic math and reading skills. The routine brought her a sense of purpose, however small. Occasionally, she received letters from people outside, some from strangers expressing support and others from critics condemning her. She rarely responded. Her parents visited her regularly. Their conversations were often strained but filled with love. Margaret brought photos and updates about the family, trying to inject a sense of normalcy into their visits. Charles was quieter, his words fewer but no less heartfelt. They never stopped telling her they loved her, even when the weight of the situation hung heavily between them. Despite the monotony of prison life, Delilah often reflected on the trial and its aftermath. She wondered about Julius, not the man she had married, but the boy he had been when he committed the crime that changed her life. What had driven him to such darkness? Had he truly changed, as he had claimed? These questions lingered, unanswered but persistent. She also thought about the people who had rallied to her defense. Letters from survivors of similar experiences often brought her to tears. They saw her as a symbol of strength, someone who had fought back against a system that often failed victims. But she didn't feel like a symbol. She was just a woman who had made a choice, one that came with consequences she now lived with every day. After her 15th year in prison, Delilah's case came up for parole. The hearing was grueling, with the parole board questioning her extensively about her actions, her remorse, and what she had learned during her time in prison. "Do you regret what you did?" one board member asked, his tone sharp. Delilah paused before answering. "I regret the pain I caused my family and the people who cared about me. I regret that my actions hurt them. But I don't regret standing up for myself. I don't regret taking back my power." Her response drew mixed reactions from the board, but ultimately, they granted her parole. Her exemplary behavior, participation in therapy, and the support from her counselors played a significant role in their decision. Adjusting to life outside prison was both liberating and challenging. Delilah was in her 40s now, her once youthful face marked by years of hardship. She moved into a small apartment provided by a re-entry program, finding solace in the simplicity of her new life. She took a job at a non-profit that supported survivors of trauma, using her story to inspire and help others. Her parents, now older and slower, were her strongest supporters. Margaret cried when she saw Delilah step out of the prison gates, wrapping her daughter in a long, tearful embrace. Charles smiled for the first time in years, his pride evident even in his silence. Delilah's story remained a topic of debate in the public eye long after her release. Documentaries, articles, and opinion pieces continued to dissect her actions and their implications. But for Delilah, the noise no longer mattered. She had spent too many years defined by what had been done to her and what she had done in return. Now, she was focused on moving forward, one day at a time. Her past would always be a part of her, but it no longer consumed her. She had found a fragile peace, built on the understanding that life was messy, painful, and sometimes unfair, but also filled with the possibility of redemption and growth. Delilah Grant was no longer just a victim or a convict. She was a survivor, and that was enough.